the early life and hidden tragedy. Few people who watched the lovable monster on television ever imagined the life behind the makeup. To millions of viewers, Fred Gwynne was simply Herman Munster, the towering, goofy father from the classic sitcom The Munsters. But behind that unforgettable character was a man whose life was filled with creativity, personal tragedy, and incredible resilience. His journey to fame didn't start in Hollywood studios. It started decades earlier in New York City, in a home filled with art, imagination, and eventually heartbreaking loss. Frederick Hubbard Gwynne was born on July 10, 1926, in New York City. He came from a family that valued creativity as much as success. His father, Frederick Walker Gwynne, was a successful stockbroker and partner in a securities firm. His mother, Dorothy Ficken, was an artist with a lively imagination. In fact, she helped create a popular advertising character named Sonny Jim, which appeared on cereal boxes and became widely recognized across the country. For a time, the character became so famous that surveys ranked the name Sonny Jim among the most recognizable in America. Alongside powerful figures like J.P. Morgan and President Roosevelt. Despite growing up in a comfortable home, Fred's childhood was not without tragedy. He had 2 siblings, but both passed away at very young ages, leaving Fred essentially raised as an only child. Still, he remembered his early years as warm and loving. His parents were often home, and the household was filled with creativity and encouragement. That peaceful life changed suddenly when Fred was only 8 years old. His father had been suffering from severe sinus infections for months and eventually needed surgery. What should have been a routine operation ended in tragedy. His father died on the operating table. For young Fred, the shock was overwhelming. He later recalled crying for days after hearing the news. The loss devastated both Fred and his mother. She had already buried 2 children, and now she had lost her husband. All she had left was Fred, and he had only her. The emotional weight of that moment pushed a young boy into isolation. Fred withdrew from the outside world. He stopped playing with friends and rarely left his room. Instead, he spent most of his time reading books and keeping to himself, but his mother refused to let him disappear into sadness. Knowing how much creativity meant to both of them, she began encouraging him to draw with her. At first, it was simple doodles at the kitchen table. Then they turned into small drawing contests. Soon they were painting together on the porch and sketching scenery outdoors. Slowly, art became the bridge that brought Fred back to life. Financially, Fred and his mother were secure. His father had made wise investments and left behind life insurance and dividend-paying stocks that allowed them to live comfortably. Because of that security, Fred was able to focus on education and creativity without worrying about financial survival. By the time he reached high school, Fred had transformed from a quiet, withdrawn boy into someone more confident and outgoing. His passion for art had grown tremendously, and when the time came for higher education, he was accepted into the prestigious Groton School in Massachusetts, one of the most selective preparatory schools in the United States. At Groton, Fred flourished. He studied various forms of art, from expressionist painting to cartoon illustration. But something unexpected also captured his attention: acting. He joined the school's drama program and discovered that performing in front of an audience excited him. just as much as painting or drawing dot by his senior year. Fred Gwynne had two passions, art and acting, and both seemed to offer a path forward. But the world had other plans. As he prepared to graduate, World War II was in full force, and like many young Americans of his generation, Fred felt the call to serve his country. 1 month before his 18th birthday, the tall, skinny teenager, already standing 6'5" enlisted in the United States Navy. At that moment, his life took a dramatic turn away from classrooms and theater stages and into the uncertain world of wartime service. What he couldn't have known then was that the experiences ahead, from military life to Harvard University, Broadway stages, and eventually television stardom, would slowly shape him into the actor the world would one day recognize as the most lovable monster on television. War. Harvard and the beginning of an acting career. When Fred Gwynne enlisted in the United States Navy near the end of World War II, he was already an unusually tall young man. Standing at nearly 6'5" and extremely thin, he had the kind of physical presence that people noticed immediately. But in the Navy, height didn't matter nearly as much as discipline and skill. Fred was assigned to a submarine chaser as a radio operator, where his main responsibility was listening to Morse code transmissions through a headset for long periods of time. The constant sound of the Morse code signals blasting through his headphones eventually became unbearable. The loud, sharp noises gave him severe headaches and made it difficult for him to sleep. After struggling with the position for a while, Fred requested a different assignment on the ship, even if it meant taking on something more dangerous. The Navy agreed to move him, but the new job came with its own challenges. He was stationed near the ship's anti-aircraft guns, which were far louder than anything he had heard through the radio headset. Fortunately, those guns were not fired very often. Fred served at sea for about 2 years until the war finally came to an end. When he returned home, he used the GI Bill to continue his education. At first he studied art in Massachusetts, working odd jobs to support himself. One of those jobs included teaching swimming at a yacht club, something he did simply to earn enough money to continue pursuing his education. Eventually, Fred was accepted into Harvard University. It was there that he felt he truly discovered who he was meant to be. Harvard offered him the opportunity to combine his love of art, performance, and writing. He became a cartoonist and illustrator for the famous Harvard Lampoon, a humor magazine that had already produced many talented writers and comedians. Among his fellow students on the staff were future literary stars John Updike and George Plimpton. Fred quickly became one of the leading creative forces behind the magazine. His political satire cartoons were so sharp and clever that some were even published in national magazines. But art was only one side of his life at Harvard. He also joined the university's theatrical organizations and sang with the Harvard Crocodillos, an a cappella singing group that performed for audiences around the country. On stage, Fred discovered something powerful. His towering height, expressive face, and deep voice made him stand out instantly. Rather than trying to hide his unusual appearance, he began using it to his advantage in comedic performances. At one point, he even performed burlesque comedy sketches while dressed in costume, towering above everyone else on stage at 6'5". Audiences loved it. By the time he graduated from Harvard in 1951, Fred Gwynne had built an impressive reputation as an artist, writer, and performer. Instead of leaving Massachusetts immediately, he joined the Brattle Repertory Theater, where he began performing regularly on stage. His talent quickly became obvious to everyone around him. Before long, theater professionals were telling him the same thing. If he wanted a real acting career, he needed to try Broadway. So Fred packed his bags and moved to New York City, hoping to build a future in theater. At first, things did not go as smoothly as he had hoped. While he attended auditions and job interviews, casting directors kept giving him the same feedback. They told him he was too tall, too skinny, and his long face made him difficult to cast in traditional roles. Over and over again, he heard the same discouraging words, but Fred refused to give up. Instead of quitting, he accepted smaller roles in off-Broadway productions while also working a day job at a prestigious advertising agency called J. Walter Thompson. There he used his artistic talent to design brand logos and write advertising copy. It was steady work, and it allowed him to continue chasing his dream of acting. Around this time, something else important happened in his life. While attending a wedding for a college friend, Fred met a woman named Jean Foxy Renard. She was the granddaughter of former New York City Mayor William Gaynor. The two quickly formed a strong connection, and within a year they were married. The newlyweds settled into an apartment in Manhattan. Fred balanced his time between his advertising job and theater auditions, determined to make his acting career work. Then finally, in 1952, an opportunity appeared that would change everything. He was invited to audition for a Broadway play called Mrs. McThing. This time, the casting director saw something special in him. Fred landed the role, acting alongside legendary actress Helen Hayes. The play became a success and ran for more than 300 performances. For Fred, it felt like life had finally begun to fall into place. He had a stable career, a successful Broadway show, and a loving marriage. Soon after, the couple welcomed their first child, a baby boy named Kieran. Fred believed he had reached the happiest chapter of his life. But within a short time, a tragic accident involving his young son would once again shake his world and leave emotional scars that would stay with him for years to come. Tragedy, Hollywood, and the road to the Munsters. Just as Fred Gwynne felt his life was finally settling into a perfect rhythm, tragedy struck his family once again. One evening, Fred and his wife Foxy were relaxing in their living room while their young son Kieran played nearby. At one point, the toddler pulled himself up on the edge of the couch and began trying to stand. Fred noticed that the boy was losing his balance and quickly jumped from his chair to catch him. But he was just a moment too late. Kieran fell forward and struck his head on the corner of the coffee table. The accident caused a severe brain injury known as a subdural hematoma. Doctors rushed the child into emergency surgery to relieve the pressure in his brain. The operation was successful in saving his life, but it left permanent consequences. Soon after returning home from the hospital, Kieran began experiencing severe seizures and epilepsy. The condition never completely went away. Fred blamed himself. Even though the accident happened in a matter of seconds, he carried the guilt for years. Every time his son suffered a seizure, Fred would break down emotionally, convinced that he could have prevented the fall if he had moved faster. It was a heavy emotional burden that followed him throughout his career. Despite the challenges at home, Fred continued working on stage. During one of his Broadway performances, an important figure happened to be sitting in the audience, legendary film director Elia Kazan. Kazan noticed Fred immediately. At first, it was his height that caught the director's attention. Fred's tall frame made him perfect for certain intimidating roles. But as the performance continued, Kazan realized something even more important. Fred Gwynne was a genuinely talented actor. Not long after the performance, Kazan invited Fred to audition for a small role in a new film he was directing called On the Waterfront, starring Marlon Brando. Although the part was small and only required him to appear in a few scenes as a dockside henchman, it marked Fred's first step into Hollywood filmmaking. The movie would go on to become one of the most famous films of the decade. And even though his role was brief, people in the industry began to notice him. Around the same time, Fred and Foxy welcomed their second child, a daughter named Gaynor. Life at home was growing, even while Fred's career slowly expanded. Then another opportunity arrived in 1955 when television producers from The Phil Silvers Show were searching for a tall comedic actor to join the cast. Fred's name came highly recommended. He auditioned and landed the role of Corporal Ed Honnigan, a character known as the Stomach because he was portrayed as an eating champion. The show was popular, and the experience helped Fred gain valuable exposure in the world of television comedy. However, his time on the series didn't last very long. But surprisingly, Fred didn't mind. In fact, the break gave him time to focus on another creative dream he had been quietly working on. Fred began writing and illustrating his own books. Drawing from his artistic background and his experience in advertising, he created a humorous book called Best in Show, which featured cartoons comparing pets with their owners who looked just like them. The concept was simple, funny, and surprisingly successful. The book eventually made its way onto the New York Times bestseller list. The success of the book brought Fred national recognition as an author and illustrator. It also provided enough financial security for him to leave his advertising job and focus entirely on creative work. For the next couple of years, he continued writing and illustrating additional books, including one filled with adult humor cartoons titled What's Nude. During this period, Fred had stepped away from acting almost entirely, but one unexpected phone call pulled him back toward television. The call came from television producer Nat Hiken, who had previously worked with Fred on The Phil Silvers Show. Hiken was developing a new sitcom for NBC and believed Fred would be perfect for one of the lead roles. The show was called Car 54, Where Are You? And it centered around two New York City police officers patrolling the streets of the Bronx. Fred was cast as Officer Francis Muldoon, the tall and serious partner to Joey Ross's shorter, more comedic character. The chemistry between the two actors worked perfectly. When the show premiered in 1961, audiences immediately responded to the humor and characters. Fred's towering height next to his partner created a visual comedy dynamic that viewers loved. The series quickly gained popularity and helped establish Fred Gwynne as a recognizable television actor. At the same time, Fred and Foxy welcomed their third child, a son named Dylan. For a moment, life once again seemed to be stabilizing. His career was growing, his family was expanding, and the future looked promising. But fate had another devastating moment waiting for the Gwynne family, a tragedy so heartbreaking that it would shake Fred to his core and change the direction of his life once again. Heartbreak, fame, and becoming Herman Munster, while Fred Gwynne's career on television was steadily growing with the success of Car 54, Where Are You? His personal life was about to face its most devastating moment. One afternoon in 1963, while Fred was on set filming the show, he received an emergency phone call from home. The voice on the other end delivered news no parent ever wants to hear. His young son Dylan, who was not even a year old yet, had fallen into the family's backyard swimming pool and drowned. The news shattered Fred. Witnesses on set said he collapsed to his knees and broke down in tears. The entire cast and crew were heartbroken for him and his family. Production stopped as everyone tried to process what had happened. Fred took time away from the show to be with his wife and children during the unimaginable loss. But when he eventually returned to the set, he tried to act as if everything was normal. He smiled, joked with the crew, and performed his scenes just like he always had. No one wanted to bring up the tragedy, but those who worked closely with him could see the pain he was carrying. At the end of each filming day, Fred would quietly walk to his car with his head lowered, clearly still grieving. The tragedy also created strain within his marriage. Fred had already carried guilt over the earlier accident involving their son Kieran, and now his wife Foxy was overwhelmed with guilt about Dylan's drowning. The emotional weight became too much for both of them. What most people around them didn't realize was that the couple had quietly separated while Fred continued filming the show. Despite the pain in his personal life, Fred pushed forward with his work. He believed that staying busy was the only way to keep himself from being consumed by grief. But then another unexpected blow arrived. After finishing the second season of Car 54, Where Are You?, the network made a sudden decision to cancel the show. Just like that, Fred's successful television series was over. Determined not to fall apart, Fred returned to the theater and joined the Broadway production of Here's Love. Around that same time, he and Foxy began working through their difficulties and eventually reconciled. The family moved forward together, trying to rebuild their lives. Then, out of nowhere, another phone call came, this time from Hollywood producers. They were developing a new television project and believed Fred would be perfect for it. When they described the role, however, Fred was initially skeptical. They wanted him to play a Frankenstein-like monster character in a comedy series. At first, Fred was confused. He believed they were only interested in his height and unusual appearance. But the producers quickly explained that this was not just about looking like a monster. The character would be the heart of a family sitcom, and the role required strong comedic timing and personality. That's why they had called him. Curious, Fred agreed to fly to Hollywood and film the pilot episode. The show was called The Munsters. The early version looked a little different from what audiences would later see. But the basic idea was simple: a family of monsters living like a normal suburban household. After filming the first pilot, the network asked for some changes. A second pilot was produced with adjustments to the cast and tone. Fred remained in the lead role as Herman Munster, the lovable but clumsy father of the strange family. With the improvements in place, the network finally decided to take a chance on the series. On September 24, 1964, the Munsters officially premiered on CBS. Almost immediately, it captured the attention of audiences across the country. Fred Gwynne's portrayal of Herman Munster was something unique. Instead of playing the character as frightening, he turned Herman into a gentle, kind-hearted giant with childlike innocence to create Herman's personality. Fred actually borrowed many small details from someone he loved deeply, his own mother. He used her mannerisms, her tone of voice, and even some of her expressions when building the character. The result was a monster that audiences didn't fear, but adored. However, becoming Herman Munster also came with serious challenges. Each day, Fred had to sit in the makeup chair for nearly 2.5 hours while the team applied the heavy makeup, headpiece, and costume. Once filming started, the thick outfit trapped heat under the bright studio lights, making it extremely uncomfortable. Fred later joked that when they removed his boots at the end of the day, they could practically pour the sweat out of them. Still, he pushed through the long hours and physical discomfort because the show was a hit. The Munsters quickly became one of the most popular sitcoms on television. Fred Gwynne had finally achieved the kind of fame that actors dream about. But as successful as the show was, another unexpected challenge was quietly approaching, one that would eventually change the course of his career once again. The price of fame and the struggle after the Munsters. The success of the Munsters quickly turned Fred Gwynne into one of the most recognizable faces on television. Every week, millions of viewers tuned in to watch the strange but lovable Munster family. Herman Munster, with his towering height, flat-top head, and booming laugh, became the center of the show's humor. Fred had managed to do something special with the character. Instead of portraying a frightening monster, he made Herman gentle, kind-hearted, and almost childlike. Audiences adored him, but the popularity of the show also came with serious challenges behind the scenes. For Fred, playing Herman Munster was physically exhausting. Each morning he had to arrive hours before filming, began to sit through the long process of applying makeup and costume. The heavy headpiece, thick facial makeup, bulky suit, and massive boots were all designed to make him look larger and more monstrous. Under the bright studio lights, the costume trapped heat and made it extremely uncomfortable. Fred later explained that he often felt like he was cooking inside the outfit. Sweat would pour from his body during filming, and the crew sometimes had to remove his boots at the end of the day just to pour the sweat out. To keep him from becoming dehydrated, he was given salt tablets and told to drink large amounts of lemonade during filming. Despite the discomfort, Fred never complained publicly. He knew that the success of the show supported not only his career, but also the jobs of everyone working on the production. The show's first season performed well in the ratings, and the characters became part of American pop culture. Fans loved the strange but funny world of the Munster family. However, television in the 1960s was extremely competitive, and new shows were constantly fighting for viewers. Then, in 1966, a new series suddenly appeared on television that changed everything. It was a colorful, action-packed superhero show called Batman. Unlike the Munsters, which was filmed in black and white, Batman exploded onto television screens with bright colors, dramatic fight scenes, and a completely different style of entertainment. Almost overnight, audiences began shifting their attention to the new show. As the ratings for Batman climbed higher and higher, the viewership for the Munsters slowly began to drop. The studio tried to save the series by creating a full-length movie titled Munster Go Home, which was filmed in color. The idea was to bring new excitement to the franchise and draw viewers back to the television series. Unfortunately, the effort wasn't enough. After only 2 seasons, the network made the decision to cancel the Munsters. For many fans, it was shocking news. But surprisingly, Fred Gwynne himself was not completely disappointed. He believed the show had already run its course and that it was time to move on to new opportunities. At the final cast gathering, Fred even joked that now everyone could finally go home and watch Batman. The comment reflected his sense of humor, but it also hinted at the reality that his most famous role had come to an end. After the show ended, Fred decided to step away from acting for a while. He spent about 6 months focusing on his health and spending time with his family. The intense schedule and heavy costume had taken a physical toll on him, and he needed time to recover. Eventually, he returned to auditioning for new roles, hoping to continue his acting career. But something unexpected began happening. Casting directors recognized him immediately, not as Fred Gwynne the actor, but as Herman Munster. No matter how talented he was, producers and directors had difficulty imagining him as anyone else. Again and again, he heard the same thing during auditions. Some casting agents didn't even allow him to read for the part. They simply told him that audiences would always see Herman Munster. When they looked at him, Fred had become a victim of something actors fear the most: typecasting. The role that had brought him fame was now making it nearly impossible for him to find new work. After 2 frustrating years of trying to break free from the shadow of Herman Munster, Fred finally reached a decision. He told his longtime co-star, Al Lewis, that he was tired of fighting the situation. If Hollywood couldn't see him as anything other than Herman, then he would simply leave Hollywood behind. So, Fred packed up his family and moved back to New York. Instead of chasing television roles in California, he decided to return to the theater, the place where his acting career had first begun. What he didn't realize yet was that this move would open the door to an entirely different chapter of his life, one where he would rediscover his love for writing, storytelling, and creativity in ways that had nothing to do with television monsters' reinvention, loss, and a late career comeback. Leaving Hollywood behind turned out to be one of the most important decisions Fred Gwynne ever made. Back in New York, far from the pressure of television studios and casting offices, he was able to reconnect with the things he had loved long before fame ever arrived. Theater welcomed him again, and the stage gave him something television had taken away: the chance to be seen as a serious actor rather than just a television character. At the same time, Fred returned to another passion that had always been part of his life: writing and illustrating books. Drawing from the same creativity that had helped him recover from childhood grief years earlier, he began producing children's books filled with clever humor and playful language. Many of his stories focused on the funny misunderstandings that happen when children hear words that sound alike but have different meanings. One of his most popular books was The King Who Reigned, a story built around homophones, words that sound the same but mean different things. In the book, phrases like "the king who reigned" instead of "the king who reigned" created a world of silly confusion that children loved. The book became widely praised by teachers and parents for making language both funny and educational. He followed it with other successful titles, including A Chocolate Mousse for Dinner, which played with similar word jokes and imaginative illustrations. These books became classroom favorites across the United States. For many children growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, Fred Gwynne was not Herman Munster at all. He was the author of the funny books they read in school. While his professional life was evolving, his personal life faced another difficult turning point. After nearly 3 decades of marriage, Fred and his wife Foxy decided to separate permanently. The couple had been through enormous emotional strain over the years, including the tragic loss of their son, Dylan, and the health challenges of their son, Kieran. In 1980, after 28 years of marriage, they finalized their divorce. Not long afterward, Fred met a woman named Deborah Flater while working on theater projects. The two quickly formed a strong connection, and they eventually married. The relationship brought a sense of peace and stability back into Fred's life during a period when many things were changing. Throughout the 1980s, Fred continued acting in theater productions and occasionally appeared in television shows and films. Slowly, the industry began to see him differently. As time passed, the image of Herman Munster faded just enough for directors to recognize the range he had always possessed as an actor. Then, in the early 1990s, one role finally gave Fred the chance to prove himself to a whole new generation of audiences. He was cast as Judge Chamberlain Haller in the courtroom comedy My Cousin Vinny, starring Joe Pesci and Marisa Tomei. Fred's performance as the serious but increasingly frustrated judge became one of the film's funniest elements. His calm authority clashing with the chaotic courtroom antics created unforgettable scenes. Audiences loved the performance, and many younger viewers who watched the movie had no idea they were seeing the same actor who once played Herman Munster decades earlier. For Fred, the role felt like a quiet victory. After years of struggling against typecasting, he had finally delivered a performance that reminded Hollywood and the public that he was far more than a single character. But sadly, just as his career was experiencing a late resurgence, Fred Gwynne began facing a battle far more serious than anything he had experienced in acting. A devastating diagnosis was coming that would bring the remarkable story of his life to its final years and a lasting legacy. After decades of navigating fame, personal tragedy, and creative reinvention, Fred Gwynne seemed to have finally reached a peaceful chapter of his life. He was living quietly in the countryside with his wife Deborah, surrounded by nature and far from the pressures of Hollywood. He continued writing, painting, and occasionally acting, enjoying a slower pace that allowed him to focus on the things that had always brought him joy. His recent appearance in My Cousin Vinny had introduced him to a whole new generation of viewers. Younger audiences who watched the film loved his performance as the stern but humorous judge, and critics praised his perfect comedic timing. For many people, it was a reminder that Fred Gwynne had always been a talented and versatile actor, capable of far more than the single role that had once defined his career. But not long after the film's success, Fred began experiencing serious health problems. Doctors eventually delivered devastating news. He had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, one of the most aggressive and difficult forms of the disease. The diagnosis came suddenly and left little time for treatment options. Even while facing this difficult reality, Fred handled the situation with the same quiet dignity that had defined much of his life. Friends and family later described how he remained calm and thoughtful, focusing his energy on spending meaningful time with the people he loved most. On July 2, 1993, just 8 days before his 67th birthday, Fred Gwynne passed away at his home in Taneytown, Maryland. The news of his death saddened fans across the country. For many people who had grown up watching the Munsters, it felt like losing a familiar and beloved figure from their childhood. Yet, Fred's legacy reached far beyond a single television show. Yes, he would always be remembered as Herman Munster from the Munsters, the gentle giant who turned a classic movie monster into a lovable father figure. But the full story of his life revealed something much deeper. He was a talented stage actor who earned the respect of Broadway audiences. He was a creative writer and illustrator who produced beloved children's books that helped countless students learn about language in playful ways. And he was a man who endured profound personal losses while continuing to move forward with resilience and grace. In many ways, the character of Herman Munster reflected Fred himself. Herman was kind, loyal, and a little misunderstood, a giant who looked intimidating on the outside but had a warm and generous heart underneath. That same description could easily apply to the man who played him. Today, decades after the Munsters first aired, the show continues to find new fans through reruns and streaming. And every time Herman Munster laughs, stumbles, or tries his best to be a good father, viewers are seeing a small piece of Fred Gwynne's spirit shining through the character. Behind the monster makeup was a thoughtful artist, a devoted father, and a resilient man who lived a life far more complex than most people ever realized. And in the end, that is the legacy Fred Gwynne left behind. Not just a famous character, but a story of creativity, perseverance, and heart that continues to be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling.